The sound came first, a low groan, deep under her boots, like something old was waking up. Maren Kessler froze mid-step, one hand still braced against a support beam, gray with more than a century of weather. Dust sifted down from the rafters above her, catching the thin light that leaked through gaps in the roof. She hadn't moved. She hadn't even breathed. But the floor had. Another groan, sharper this time. A crack spreading beneath the old planks like a vein opening under skin. She should have stepped back. Later, she'd admit that much. But something kept her still. The same stubborn curiosity that had gotten her into this barn in the first place. The same instinct that made her hand over $500 for a building most people in town wouldn't have taken for free. A sharp crack split the silence beneath her boots. Before she could react, another answered it. Then another. The sound raced beneath the old floorboards like a zipper tearing open. Not all at once, and yet all at once. The nearest plank bowed, hesitated, and dropped an inch with a sound like a held breath finally released. She threw her weight backward, grabbing for the beam, and that's when the rest of the corner let go. A whole section of flooring buckled and dropped away in front of her, boards folding into each other like a house of cards, one after another, faster than she could track. Splinters, a rush of dust rolling up in a cloud thick enough to choke on, and air, cold air, pouring up out of a black opening nearly the size of the corner itself, from somewhere that hadn't seen daylight in a very long time. She didn't fall, barely. Her heels caught the last solid edge of flooring, arms pinwheeling, and then she was still, chest heaving, staring down into a hole that shouldn't have existed, a darkness that felt older than the barn itself. What was down there, and why had nobody, in over a century, ever found it? If you've ever believed an old forgotten place still has a story worth telling, you're in the right place. Subscribe for more true-to-life rural mysteries like this one. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. 3 months earlier, Maren didn't know the barn existed. She was a woman in her mid-30s who'd spent the last several years restoring old houses in a small town in the Blue Ridge foothills, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business before it happened. She had a good eye for bones, for knowing which old buildings were worth saving and which ones were simply worth mourning. Her neighbors called it a talent. Her bank account called it a problem. The barn sat on the edge of the old Whitfield property, half a mile off the county road, hidden behind a stand of walnut trees that had grown wild for decades. Locals called it the Whitfield barn, though nobody living could say much about the family who built it. It had survived 2 world wars, a handful of floods, and at least 1 tornado that had leveled the farmhouse beside it sometime in the 1970s. The barn, somehow, had stood. Nobody wanted it. The roof sagged on one side. The main doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. Half the siding had silvered and split from a century of sun and rain, and there was a smell inside. Not rot, exactly, but something close to it. Real estate agents called it a liability. Farmers called it a fire hazard. The county had declared the structure unsafe 2 years before Maren ever laid eyes on it, which meant whoever took it on would either have to stabilize it properly or eventually tear it down themselves. When the Whitfield estate finally went to auction, it was broken into parcels. The farmhouse lot, the open fields, and, almost as an afterthought, a small overgrown parcel that included nothing but the barn itself. Nobody wanted to buy a building they'd likely have to demolish. The opening bid on that parcel was $500. Maren was the only one who raised her hand. She remembered the laughter. Not cruel exactly, more disbelieving. A neighbor named Russ Calloway, who'd farmed the land next door for 30 years, actually shook his head and told her she'd just bought herself a lawsuit waiting to happen. "That thing's gonna fall on somebody," he said. "Better hope it's not you." She didn't have a plan, not really, just a feeling. The kind of feeling she got walking into old buildings that other people had given up on, that there was something worth understanding here, even if she couldn't say what yet. The first few weeks were unglamorous. She cleared decades of debris, hauled out rusted farm equipment nobody remembered leaving behind, and patched the worst of the roof just to keep the weather out. It was slow, aching work, and more than once she caught herself wondering if Russ had been right. Then she started noticing things that didn't quite add up. The floorboards in the north corner sounded different when she walked across them. hollow almost, compared to the solid thunk everywhere else. She figured it was just rot at first, but when she knelt down and rapped her knuckles against the wood, the sound wasn't soft. It was sharp. Too sharp for rotted timber. Then there were the tool marks. Deep gouges in the foundation stones near that same corner, the kind left by hand chisels, clustered in a way that didn't match the rest of the barn's construction. Everywhere else, the stonework was efficient, practical fieldstone stacking, the kind any competent 19th century farmer could manage. But this corner had been worked, shaped. Someone had spent real time there, and the cats wouldn't go near it. Maren had taken in a barn cat during her second week, a scarred orange tom she started calling Duke, mostly because he refused to leave once she started feeding him. Duke went everywhere in that barn except the north corner. He'd walk right up to the edge of it and stop, ears back, and simply refuse to cross. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Animals were unpredictable. But she started paying attention anyway. The cold air was what finally got her digging deeper, literally. On warm afternoons, when the rest of the barn sat still and stuffy, a thin stream of cold air rose steadily from a hairline crack in the floorboards of that same corner. Not drafty cold, cellar cold. The kind of cold that meant open space below, not just packed dirt. She started asking around. The county archivist, a patient woman named Dolores Ibbotson, who'd spent 30 years cataloging land deeds nobody else wanted to read, found something curious in the property records. The Whitfield barn had been built in 1861, not unusual for the area, but the original filing mentioned an underbuilding that later records never referenced again. No description, no explanation, just a phrase that vanished from the paperwork after 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. That single detail changed everything about how Maren looked at the barn. She began researching 19th century barn construction in earnest, learning things she'd never fully appreciated before. Barns from that era weren't just storage buildings. They were engineered structures, built using timber framing techniques passed down through generations, where massive hand-hewn beams were joined not with nails but with mortise and tenon joints and wooden pegs, a method strong enough to outlast the men who built it. Fieldstone foundations, stacked without mortar or bound with crude lime mortar, were common, but they were rarely reinforced or shaped beyond what function required, which made the tool marks in that north corner even stranger. Someone had put skilled effort into stonework that served no obvious structural purpose. She brought in a local timber framer named Everett Voss to look at the beams overhead, half expecting him to tell her the sagging roofline was the real danger. Instead, he spent 20 minutes crouched in the north corner, running his hand along the stone. "This isn't ordinary foundation work," he told her, frowning at the tool marks. "Somebody spent a lot of effort building something under this corner. And whatever it is, it wasn't meant to be found." He told her not to walk on that section again until he could come back with proper equipment, and then he packed up his tools and left for the day. Maren meant to wait, but that evening, alone in the barn with a flashlight, she found herself drawn back to the north corner anyway, just to look, she told herself, just to listen to that hollow sound one more time. That was when the floor gave way beneath her boots. When the dust settled and her heart stopped hammering, Maren looked down into the opening and saw stone steps, worn smooth, descending into darkness. Duke padded over sometime that first evening, tail low, and for the first time since Maren had known him, he crept right up to the edge of the opening and peered down the stone steps without flinching. Whatever had kept him away from that corner for weeks, it seemed the collapse had finally let it out. She didn't go down alone. The next morning she called Everett back, along with a structural engineer to make sure the rest of the floor would hold, and together they went down with flashlights into a space that appeared untouched for well over a century. It was a root cellar, but not an ordinary one. The walls were lined with the same carefully worked fieldstone from above, and the space was larger than any root cellar Maren had ever seen, built with a permanence that suggested it had served a purpose far beyond storing potatoes and preserves through winter. Wooden shelving, long collapsed, lined one wall. And carved into a support beam near the entrance, faint but unmistakable, were initials and a date, 1862. Dolores, the archivist, was the one who finally pieced the history together. Local county records from the Civil War era, cross-referenced with a handful of surviving letters in the Historical Society's collection, painted a picture of a region caught between divided loyalties. The Whitfield family, it turned out, had quietly supported the Underground Railroad's northern routes through the region, a fact never formally recorded, for obvious reasons, but hinted at in family correspondence Dolores unearthed in a box nobody had opened in decades. The chamber beneath the barn wasn't a hiding place for gold or treasure. Everything about it pointed toward something else entirely. A hidden space, built with genuine skill and secrecy, the kind meant to shelter people, not possessions. A preservation historian from the state's Historical Society spent weeks going over what Everett and Dolores had found: the construction style, the location, the timing against the Whitfield family's correspondence, and the region's documented network of hidden shelters along the Underground Railroad's northern routes. No single piece of it was proof on its own, and she was careful to say so. Written records from that kind of operation rarely survived, by design. But taken together, she said, the evidence pointed strongly in one direction, that the chamber had almost certainly served as a way station, sheltering people making one of the most dangerous journeys a person could take toward freedom. She called it one of the more intact examples she'd encountered, not because it was grand, but because it had survived at all, forgotten precisely because it had been built to be forgotten. Maren didn't restore the barn to make money. She restored it because, standing in that cellar for the first time, she understood she wasn't just preserving a building. She was preserving a piece of courage that had nearly been erased by time, buried under a century and a half of dust and silence and floorboards nobody thought to question. Russ Calloway came by one afternoon that fall, hat in hand, and admitted he'd been wrong. He didn't say much else. He didn't need to. The barn still stands today, its north corner reinforced, but left otherwise untouched. A small marker near the entrance explaining what lies beneath. People visit now, not many, but enough. They stand quietly at the top of those stone steps, and imagine what it must have felt like to wait down there in the dark, listening for footsteps overhead, hoping they belonged to someone kind. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. The things we overlook aren't always empty. Sometimes the most important history is hiding exactly where nobody thought to look. Under a floor everyone assumed was solid. In a building everyone assumed was worthless, waiting for someone patient enough to listen to what it was trying to say. What do you think the people who built that hidden room would want us to remember about them? If this story moved you, consider subscribing. There are more places like this one out there, forgotten, waiting, and worth finding.